Hi, welcome to another evening of Straight Talk with the Connecticut Science Center. This is a program in our Science Straight Up and Women in Science series where we invite groundbreaking scientists and science communicators to share their experience, their insight, and their expertise with us in exciting and engaging ways. My name is Amy Saylor, and I'll be your host for our time together. If you enjoy this program, please consider supporting our mission by making a donation at ctsciencecenter.org or by texting Love Science to 44321. One of the many things that we humans share in common is the need to make sense of the world. And one of the ways we do this is by separating and classifying things. I think we can all agree that classifying humans and human diversity is complicated to say the least, but thankfully we have scientists to help us with that. Historically, we've tried to order humans into categories by things like culture and ancestry, intellect, and of course, race. In 2003, with the completion of the Human Genome Project, scientists uncovered the DNA sequence of the entire human genome, that being our complete set of genetic information within our DNA. However, it left us with even more questions, and it left scientists searching the human genome, wondering if categories of race are genetically coded within each of us. There are lots of important scientific questions about race. Is race biological? Is race a potent social construct, or is it just a conventional and a convenient social classification that many of us, you and I, use every day to better understand ourselves and those around us? Perhaps more importantly, and most fitting for this conversation, is how are race concepts and terms used within science and through the practice of science? These are just some of the questions that have motivated this night's roundtable discussion and are bringing together some of the best minds to advance our understanding of the persistence of race in scientific research. Before we delve into tonight's program, let me give you a roadmap of how this is going to play out. In a moment, I'll introduce you to Dr. Sarah Rowe, who will serve as our moderator. She will move us through some of the key questions that we'd like to have our guests address in this time. And with her guidance and expertise, I'm sure that we'll have a thought-provoking and productive conversation. As we move into latter segments of the program, you'll be treated to an a cappella performance of Lift Every Voice and Sing, after which time my Science Center colleague, Tyler Green, will facilitate a Q&A period between you and our esteemed guests. Tyler will actually be monitoring your comments and your questions throughout the evening, so please be sure to include your questions and your comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible by the end of the evening. We'll end the evening with a glimpse into the Science Center's newest permanent exhibition, Genome and Me, where my colleague and genomics educator, Melissa Garafola, will share about some of the genetic science that frames our discussion tonight. And of course, we hope to see you here soon to see that exhibition in person. So without further delay, I am delighted to introduce you to tonight's moderator, Dr. Sarah Rowe, who, in addition to being a wonderful thought partner and collaborator, is an associate professor of history and philosophy at Southern Connecticut State University, where she is the director of the Research Center on Values in Emergent Science and Technology. Dr. Rowe specializes in history and philosophy of science, feminist philosophy, and biomedical ethics. Her research can be found at the intersection of science and ethics and very often focuses on issues surrounding race and gender. She is co-chair of the Philosophy of Science Women's Caucus, secretary for the International Society for the History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Biology. And if that's not enough, she's the program co-chair of History and Philosophy of Science for the Pacific Division of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Thank you, Dr. Rowe, for joining us this evening. I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Amy. It's my honor to introduce to you tonight our esteemed panelists. First, let me introduce Dr. Quayshawn Spencer. He is the Robert S. Blank Presidential Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. He has a PhD in philosophy and an MS in biology from Stanford University. He specializes in philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, and philosophy of race. His research focuses on metaphysical problems in his areas of specialization, and his work has appeared in a wide range of philosophy journals, such as Philosophy of Science and Philosophical Studies. His research has been funded by the Ford Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and the American Philosophical Association. He is a co-author of the book, What is Race? 4 Philosophical Views, which was published with Oxford University Press in 2019. He is also the editor of The Race Debates from Metaphysics to Medicine, a forthcoming edited volume with Oxford University Press. He is an editorial board member for multiple philosophy journals, such as Ergo and Biology and Philosophy, and handles primarily race-related submissions to those journals. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Spencer. Next, Dr. Keitra Thompson completed her doctorate of nursing practice at Johns Hopkins School of Nursing, receiving her undergraduate degree in anthropology and women's, gender, and sexuality studies from Emory University. She completed an accelerated bachelor's in nursing and subsequent master's in nursing, focused on family primary care at Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. In 2017, her commitment to high quality primary care across the lifespan led her to Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center, wherein she completed a year-long postgraduate advanced practice provider fellowship in the family medicine department. Throughout her undergraduate and graduate matriculation, she has been actively involved in both quantitative and qualitative research projects, volunteerism, and advocacy. She has a background in psychiatric community health nursing, correctional healthcare, adolescent wellness, and women's health. Her doctorate work focused on the integration of trauma-informed reproductive health services into an urban family drug court program. As a VA member, please note her opinions expressed during our time tonight are hers alone and do not represent the views or opinions of the federal government. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Thompson. Finally, but importantly, Dr. Cleo Roll earned her PhD in microbiology and immunology from the University of Miami. Her graduate work focused on the generation of effector and memory T cells for adoptive immunotherapy to treat solid tumors. During her postdoctoral training at the University of Chicago in the Department of Surgery, section of neurosurgery, Dr. Roll characterized the immune response elicited in the brain tumor microenvironment. As a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Medicine, section of hematology and oncology, she examined genomic alterations in lung cancer based on the racial backgrounds of patients. Her publications include articles on the kinetics of T cell development, mechanisms of immune evasion in the brains of glaucoma patients, and the characterization of novel genomic alterations in thoracic tumors, as well as invited reviews and book chapters describing therapeutic strategies for cancer. Currently, Dr. Roll is an associate professor and program coordinator of the biotechnology program at Capital Community College and an advocate for increased access to STEM education for underserved student populations. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Roll. If all my speakers could bring up their videos, that would be super. Okay, let's get started with a rather basic sounding question, but one that is both complex and super important to ask. I'll start with Dr. Spencer. Dr. Spencer, what is race?
Well, I'm glad you asked, and not just because I just published this book, What is Race? It has a long history in scholarship, from biologists to anthropologists to sociologists to philosophers. Since I'm a philosopher, I'm going to represent the views that we've sort of laid out. And logically, you can separate the views into about 4 camps. You can think that race is a biological thing and unreal. You can think that race is a biological thing and real. You can think that race is a non-biological thing and real. And you can also think that race is a non-biological thing and unreal, which actually no one actually has defended. So if you're looking to publish a paper, you could do that in race theory. Some examples of what you might put into those slots. One of the most popular views is that race is non-biological and real. And all these folks are what they call social constructionists. One of these theorists, Sally Haslanger at MIT, she thinks that races are what she calls racialized groups. where the groups of people that look like they seem to be similar in physical appearances and geographic ancestry, but really what's similar about them is their position in the social hierarchy in our society, right? But you could be a biological view, have a biological view, and think that race is real, like Michael Hardiman at UCSD. He thinks that races are groups of people that look similar and have common geographic ancestry. So, you know, there's a wide array of views that are out there.
Thank you. Dr. Thompson, what is race?
Well, thank you. I think that Dr. Spencer really, provided a really great overview there of the different perspectives that one can take in terms of looking at race and analyzing race. I think, that in my mind and many people's minds, race is a social construct that, has been used to kind of describe biology. But in and of itself, race is a concept that really has its origins back in slavery, when those categories were put into place and has then carried over to what we see now. And it's also often used as a determinative factor, but there's not necessarily any scientific grounding on kind of that race is a thing that has determinative aspects.
Thank you. And Dr. Roll, what is race? Ooh. Dr. Roll, turn on your microphone. We're missing important information.
So sorry about that. So I fall on the side of it that it's a social construct, and it's definitely used primarily from a research perspective for categorizing people based solely on phenotypic or how they look. There's really not been any definitive studies, in my opinion, that have really identified a genetic basis of race from the entire genome perspective. There are genetic variants that happen in some groups, but that's usually linked to one gene and not necessarily across as broadly as we would like to categorize groups.
Well, thank you all. Let's move on to our next question. Should we think about race biologically or socially? And you all kind of hit on this just a little bit. So in particular, in your view, how should we be thinking about race? Let's start with Dr. Spencer.
Oh, there we go. All right. I thought I might have said something too controversial in my first remarks.
No, we haven't censored you yet.
So I should say that my view on what race is a bit complex, what they call a pluralist, where I think that we have ways of talking about race that are biological and ways that are talking about race that are non-biological social constructs. So I'm kind of in the camp of everyone's right and everyone's wrong at the same time. But with respect to how we should talk about race, that's a separate debate in the literature. And I haven't really developed a view on that. However, I have a student who did just write a thesis on that, Grace Wu at Penn, and she came at it from the point of view of social justice, right? So if you're talking about engineering your terms, like how should you define your terms, you might want to have a pretty laudable goal in mind. And there's a lot of ways of thinking about social justice in literature, but one way that's pretty common is called this Rawlsian view, justice is fairness, where you focus on everyone having equal basic liberties, everyone having fair equal opportunity, and whatever differences you have in your society, you have to make sure that they're fair and they're not unjust. But when we look at the differences we have in our society, of course, we see that not all of them are fair and just. So you might want to define race in such a way that you're able to rectify those injustices, right? Now, one way that I think that we have injustices in our society is through what Jorge Garcia at Boston College has called volitional institutional racism, which is a way of being racist that's tied to the volitions of people. So you could actually intend to injure someone based on their racial membership. That's one way to be a volitional racist. But you could also have morally insufficient care with respect to other people based on their race. And of course, we know that there are instances of both types of racism in our society. But in particular, here are two examples where you can make a case for a pluralist approach to how we should define race. So think about how police officers treat certain people in our society worse than others. I think here, like a Haslangerian social constructionist view would be quite useful, because what matters isn't any sort of biological features that you have per se, but it's people's perceptions of you and how they're actually treating you. So someone like, say, Rachel Dolezal, who came to fame in 2015 for claiming that she was Black and it wasn't clear that she was based on her ancestry. She came to fame partly because she claimed, at least, she was getting pulled over from DWBs driving while Black. So if that actually is how she was being treated, I think it's right to classify her as Black in that context. But now think about, say we're doing drug design in clinical research, and we want to get a good representation of alleles that could respond differently to the drugs that we're producing, right? And in the history of medicine, we've had a bad habit of misrepresenting the genomic diversity of the human species by focusing very intensely on people of European ancestry. There's lots of cases in the history of medicine. Plavix is one case where it's a blood thinner that helps reduce the incidence of heart disease and heart attack. Our clinical studies that were FDA approved were over 90% white, right? You might think, well, what's the problem? There's nothing biological to race. But in this context, I think it's appropriate to think about race as some continental ancestry groups, because it's a blunt tool. We're not saying that everyone's similar in these races in terms of their genomics per se, but there are allele frequencies that are more likely to be found in certain groups versus others. And that is what we found in that case. Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders were more likely to have alleles that weren't capable of metabolizing this drug in the same way as everyone else. And it actually led to a twofold increase of death after being prescribed and taking Plavix. So this was settled and the whole legal stuff. But I think these are some cases where you can make a strong case for pluralism, insofar as there's no single way of thinking about race that can do everything we want to do to bring social justice in our society.
Great. Dr. Roll, should we think about race biologically or socially? And don't forget to unmute yourself.
So I think the case about Plavix that Dr. Spencer mentioned was a very classic example of why we should be considering race to some extent, but more so from an ancestry perspective and not the categories that we like to generalize races into. I think that it is the way that most scientists are leaning towards, because that's where you start to see the genetic or genomic differences, is when you look at the ancestry of people rather than how they look physically.
Great. And Dr. Thompson, should we think about race biologically or socially?
Yeah, so I'm just going to add not much, because I think that they've covered a lot, but I think that, what it really calls me to think about and consider is, the differences between, race as a social construct and ethnicity as we think about ancestry, and the fact that, there are certain ancestral traits and groups and variations that are important to consider, and how, bodies and drugs work and metabolize. But I think that race as a social construct is not helpful and can really be more harmful. And which is kind of why Dr. Spencer is saying in terms of his graduate student who took the approach of looking at social justice, because with racialized groups, we are able to understand and better see the need for social justice initiatives.
Absolutely. So given that, I'm interested to know, in your opinion, and I'll start with Dr. Thompson because we're already chatting, what are some of the dangers of classifying people into racial groups and then sanctioning those via scientific findings? And kind of, in a similar vein, what are some of the benefits?
Mm-hmm. So I think, one of the main things is that when we do categorize people into these racial groups and we attribute, different scientific findings, is that we look at race as a determining factor, And it causes us then to overlook the actual the outcomes of race in terms of racism. And so, you know, racism oftentimes is really what is happening and why there are certain variations that we might see in our findings, or people may be experiencing different things or have different outcomes, not race itself. And so I think that that's a critical thing that we have to keep in mind in terms of the dangers of scientific sanctioning based on race. I also think that in terms of what we can take from the fact that race is often used in that way is that it highlights, you know, health disparities and issues that are happening. And I think in that way, it's important for us to recognize still, though, that it's not necessarily because someone belongs to of a specific race, but their likelihood of experiencing racism, which then dictates their lived experience. And when you put those two things together, you know, you're going to find, you know, variations between groups, but we can't make the assumption that that means that, you know, there are biological basis for those differences or innate reasons why people have different outcomes.
Yeah. Dr. Roll, the same question to you. What are some of the benefits and some of the drawbacks of classifying into racial groups and then sanctioning those with scientific findings?
I think what sticks out most in my mind are the negative effects of using race in medicine and biology in general, because I think about the way that patients particularly are treated and diagnoses are missed because a disease is not known to be prevalent in certain races. And so that's what sticks out most in my mind with regards to this question. Some of the benefits, so the benefits are purely for standardization of data. If we want to look at how different groups are treated, how we are going to have representation of different groups, then race is usually a standard that we use. And I think that's probably the biggest benefit is it allows us to standardize our analysis of data and trying to capture representative races.
Absolutely. And then finally, Dr. Spencer, the same question to you. What are some of the benefits and drawbacks to sanctioning racial groups via scientific findings?
I don't think I'm going to differ much from what has already been said. I could just highlight some things. I mean, that some of the benefits would be, as Dr. Roll said, improving the efficacy of our drugs by getting better samples, improving our tools by standardizing them better. I mean, we even there are other examples I could bring up, like there are cases where we actually have lower accuracy rates for people with darker skin because they weren't included in the sample for certain sort of medical devices. So that's obviously good, gets us closer to social justice. But then the negative stuff is, well, thinking about races in certain ways, it might be counterproductive. You might actually be undermining a route to social justice, insofar as, you know, there might be a better way to go about getting what you need without using race, and maybe using race will bring up some racist attitudes or something like that. That would be counterproductive.
Yeah, well, thank you, everyone. I'm really interested in kind of learning more about how you in particular think about or utilize notions of race. So our next question is would you consider within your research or practice race a useful notion, and how so? Let's start with Dr. Thompson.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I think, you know, given that it's a social construct and the approach that I take to looking at race, I think that, you know, as Dr. Roll said, it is, you know, a helpful tool for categorizing groups of people, because that's the current category and system that we use. It's kind of societal exchange. I think that when it comes down to it, you know, in my clinical practice and also in doing research, that, you know, race allows me to, I think, understand which groups of people that I'm working with have suffered more likely than not the consequences of racism. Because the fact of the matter is that discrimination is real. So I think it enables me to be able to take a social justice perspective and lens to research and to clinical care. But I do think that, it's important to also recognize ethnicity, like we mentioned those ancestral notions in terms of clinical practice and care. But race in and of itself is not necessarily a useful notion. Unfortunately, it's a system that we have to work with, the categories we have to work with in terms of how, I'm able to categorize data sometimes in the groups, but I would love to see, us be able to figure out a different way of doing that.
Absolutely. And Dr. Roll, would you consider within your research race a useful notion?
So I think it's useful for capturing or trying to get a representative sample, because when people usually self-identify to the races, then we can build a database of samples that represent, a wide spectrum of the population. And then that allows us to uncover any possible genetic differences or genomic differences that may be present across different people. So that's kind of where I would say that race is useful. Also, just for purposes of getting funding, a lot of the federal agencies require you to include race and gender, or sex rather, as categories for funding, and to show that you are attracting these different populations into your studies. So it's kind of a required part of research, particularly if you want federal funding.
Yeah. And Dr. Spencer, do you consider within your research race a useful notion?
Absolutely, since I'm a race theorist. So
it pays your bills.
It pays the bills. But more seriously, as you mentioned in the intro, I do focus more on metaphysics of science. And for those who aren't aware, metaphysics is the study of being in reality, right? And so we're trying to figure out what there is, and we're trying to weave together explanations from all our observations across all the sciences and even ordinary life. And it would be incredibly difficult to give an account of what there is without including race in that story. And so I've definitely found it to be useful. Even philosophers who don't do metaphysics find it useful, like in social political philosophy. There's lots of work right now trying to develop arguments for reparations and so forth. Kind of hard to do that without talking about race. So yeah, absolutely.
Good. Our next important question, I think this is very timely. How might race thinking in science be playing a role in our current response to the COVID-19 pandemic? And I'll start with Dr. Roll first.
I think more so than race, what we're looking at with COVID-19 is racism. And that is what has completely changed the way that we are providing care, vaccination. And so it's more racism than race. And so I guess from that perspective, it definitely then becomes a social construct. And what we're seeing with regards to patient outcomes is definitely related to the social construct of race. The stressors that being Black or brown places you in this country, the lack of health care, you're traditionally living in multi-generational families. And so all of those impact not only the spread, but also the death rates that we see. And of course, comorbidities. So all those underlying health conditions that we have due to the fact of racism in healthcare in particular. So I think more so than race, what we're seeing with regards to COVID-19 is the effects of racism.
Yeah, that's really important. Dr. Thompson, how might race thinking in science be playing a role in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I fully agree with Dr. Roll. I would, just add that I think that it's important to realize that, racism, for those that of marginalized racial groups, that the oppression that comes with that is equivalent to that of a chronic disease, a chronic condition, because it impacts, the biology. If you think about the impact of everyday life that someone is under, if they're of a certain racial group that is marginalized, then the stresses, the opportunities they don't have. So when we think about the COVID-19 pandemic, we're going to see an exacerbation of health inequity that was happening before COVID-19 and will unfortunately, continue after, but it's heightened because these are groups of people who you know, have been oppressed and have been, as Dr. Roll mentioned, kind of living with this disparity socially, you know, health-wise, just across the spectrum. And so we're seeing the outcomes of that at exponential rates in those groups.
Yep. And finally, Dr. Spencer, how might race thinking and science be playing a role in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
I'll just strengthen some of the points just made, but I'll break a little bit by saying I think race is playing a role insofar as that's the target of the racism, right? Certain races. Now, I mean, there is philosophical work where you can define racism without adopting any sort of metaphysical view on race. Like there are some philosophers who think that. I'm of the camp where racism makes the most sense when your attitudes are being directed towards particular races. And in particular, like Garcia's volitional account, where we're not having morally sufficient care with respect to certain racial groups, at least in our society. And you can see that all throughout, it was there before, which led to a lot of the disparities that we see. But we also see it in the response, the vaccination response. We saw it in the clinical studies themselves. If you look at vaccine efficacy, right, 1- risk ratio, and the federal government actually requires federally funded clinical studies to report this value for the federal government's races. You mathematically cannot calculate that for Native Americans and Pacific Islanders from the Moderna study. I looked at it. You can't do it. It's not there. It's mathematically impossible because they didn't sample enough people, right? And there could be all kinds of reasons why drug response is different in people. And I'm not saying that it is, but I am saying that we don't know. And it's, I think, an expression of the way that we think about certain racial minorities in this country that we don't know. And this just gets perpetuated all throughout, not just a generation of the disparities in the COVID-19 pandemic, but in our response to those disparities.
Absolutely. One last final question before we turn it over to our wonderful audience. I think we all want to know, why do you think it's important to do things like what we're doing tonight by informing the public about scientific attempts to understand race, social implications of race, and the use of race thinking within science? And I'll start with Dr. Spencer.
I'm sorry?
So the question is why do you think it's important to inform the public about scientific attempts to understand race, social implications of race, and the use of race thinking within science?
Because we're all part of a society whereby being informed about important issues is important for all of our thriving. Just like being informed about civics is important for having a well-functioning political system. Being informed about science and the relevant philosophy of science, metaphysics, and so forth is important for having a well-informed people in responding to a pandemic that's science heavy. You know, if you have a bunch of people who are evolution skeptics, it's going to be kind of hard to convince them of the seriousness of what's happening, right? So that's my perspective on that.
Dr. Thompson, why is something like tonight's event so important to inform the public about scientific attempts to understand race, social implications of race, or the use of race thinking within science?
Well, I think that, you know, for one, we are in, you know, times where we all need and want, I think, to further understand. I think that when we think about where we're at now, having this conversation about race and, you know, what is it and is it real? Part of that is because of misunderstanding, you know, way back when and failing to have conversations. And I think, it's important to gather different people's perspective, ideas, and to understand the ways in which race is impacting us all at the individual level and then at the societal level. And so I think that these types of conversations are so important to engage with each other around these notions and how we see it impacting our lives and what our beliefs are about race and its application.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, Dr. Roll, why do you think it's important to inform the public about scientific attempts to understand race, social implications of race, and the use of race thinking within science?
I think it's important that everybody understands what race is and what it isn't, because that can help push us and get outside of our comfort zone and realize the historical aspect of race and what it was used to classify people, but then realize if we start to look at it from a biological or scientific perspective, we're really more alike than we are different. Yes. Right. And so the only way we're going to have those conversations and really appreciate that is if we have these types of conversations and make the topic approachable. And then the other part of your question was, sorry, I got so caught up. The social implications of race. And so everything society needs to understand and really get a grasp and be comfortable discussing race, because it is such a major part of who we are, unfortunately and fortunately, for some groups. And so society definitely needs these types of conversations where we put it into a social construct or biological construct, to have really sorry, I just lost my train of thought. To really begin to be productive and make reasonable decisions with regards to how we treat each other, how society moves, our political situation. So race plays a role in that, and I think we have to definitely look at it from a social perspective as well.
Absolutely well said. I'd like to thank particularly Dr. Spencer, Dr. Thompson, and Dr. Roll for your time and absolutely invaluable expertise. We've covered a tremendous amount tonight and much needed ground tonight. And I want to thank you personally for all of your efforts on these topics. I know that you do a lot more in this direction than just chat with me on a Thursday night. I'd like to welcome back into the conversation our dedicated host, Amy Saylor. She's got some questions from the audience and some fun things to kind of finish off our night.
Thank you, Dr. Roll. Thank you, Dr. Rowe. Thank you, Dr. Spencer, and certainly thank you, Dr. Thompson, for, again, sharing your time and your expertise with us this evening. Thank you for giving us things to think and rethink about. And before we actually go into the Q&A portion, I'd like for us to pause in recognition of Black History Month. And we will be treated to a performance by one of Yale University's premier a cappella groups, Shades of Yale. Drawing on the rich ethnic and musical backgrounds of its members, Shades strives to achieve the most dynamic and powerful music presentation possible, with a focus on music of the African diaspora. They have performed internationally for former President Obama, Nelson Mandela, and alongside music icons such as Lenny Kravitz and Ladysmith Black Mambazo in South Africa. Here to perform Lift Every Voice and Sing, also known as the Black National Anthem. Enjoy.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise. Listening skies, let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Face gotta keep on. Let us march on, marching on. Let us march on, gotta keep on marching. Let us march on, keep on marching, marching. Let us march on,
Gotta keep on marching on and on and on.
march on.
Amazing grace.
Let us march on. How sweet the sound. Let us march on. I once was alone. Let us march on. But now I'm found. Let us march on. Ooh, ah. Let us march on till victory is won. Is won.
Thank you for that wonderful performance from the Shades of Yale. If you're interested in learning more about them, you can go to shadesofyale.org and learn more about the group and support them if you'd like. So thank you all to our viewers for being engaged in this conversation. You came up with some really meaty questions, if I'm honest. So we're going to try to get through as many as we can. And I want to welcome back our guests for this. All right, well, we'll get right into it. So this first question, by the way, Dr. Rowe did a great job of sort of moving through each of our guests in order, but I'm just going to kind of open up these questions to the floor, as it were. However, this first one is from Heidi, and it is directed for Dr. Spencer first, and then carefully says for the rest of you after. It's focusing on a philosophy question, so that's perhaps why. So Heidi goes back to Jorge Garcia's concept of volitional racism that you mentioned, Dr. Spencer, and that it focuses on the heart of the racist, so to speak, and it enables us to think about racism as sort of a public health problem, and that we need to solve it for that reason, partly because of the impacts on the victims, but also because you could sort of vaccinate the public, so to speak. But Heidi is concerned that this theory is under-ambitious, and that it might potentially, in a social context, divert funds away from anti-racist efforts that focus on positively supporting BIPOC communities, researchers, to provide restitution, so forth. Also, Heidi is wondering whether racism that occurs in response to, say, fear is accurately captured by Garcia's model. So can you talk, this question is really getting at, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between theory and practice, especially as it relates to social justice initiatives? So Dr. Spencer, I'll let you address that first.
Right. I know Jorge Garcia. I'm not a Garcia apologist, so I'm not going to say that he's got the only correct theory of racism. I do think in the literature, he's been able to defend it quite successfully over, he developed it in the mid-1980s on grounds of accuracy. And so far as there's lots of objections that one can raise towards it. Some people are concerned about, well, does it really capture institutional racism? Well, sometimes we don't want to moralize institutional racism, but just disparate impact on certain groups, regardless of being infected by certain sorts of attitudes or feelings, and concerns about implicit sort of attitudes, like can it capture that? And from what he's given in literature, he can account for all of that, actually. Like implicit racism, there doesn't have to be any sort of explicit intentions or volitions in order to be a racist for Garcia. It doesn't matter how sort of it's generated in that way, as long as it gets infected with an unvirtuous character of basically unbenevolence, not being friendly, or injustice, right? And the moral perspective he's coming from is something called Aristotelian virtue ethics, which is actually the first ethical system developed by philosophers over 2,000 years ago, and it's held up over time. And basically, this is an approach to ethics where you're trying to figure out what's right and wrong, from looking at the character of the individual committing the act. Now, admittedly, this isn't going to be satisfying to people who subscribe to different views of what constitutes right and wrong action. And over the many millennia we've been doing ethics, we've come up with two other big ones. One is consequentialism, where what constitutes right or wrong is entirely determined by the consequences, right? Which might be sort of intuitively what some people are leaning more towards, right? And then another one, deontological perspective, like Kantianism, where there are certain necessary duties that you have in virtue of being an agent, like treating people autonomously, right? So I think where he gets into problems is with respect to other people's intuitions about what constitutes the good life, what constitutes right and wrong, just and unjust. But I think he has a pretty persuasive view if you give him an opportunity to address the concerns that you have from a virtue ethics point of view. But admittedly, people with consequentialist intuitions just aren't even initially going to be persuaded by everything.
That's great. I want to bring in the others as well. I mean, you know, as Dr. Spencer said, you needn't be an apologist or a polemicist, I suppose, towards Garcia. But do many of our other guests have anything to say about maybe just that last bit? You know, the relationship between theory and practice, and that can be in a clinical setting as well, which may, you know, speak to more to the expertise of the rest of you.
You know, the one thing I'll say, and I don't know necessarily that it speaks directly to that last point, but I do appreciate Heidi bringing up the fact, I think that, you know, a lot of efforts to try to dismantle racism and the structural racism that is impacting all of us in society, whether we kind of recognize it firsthand or not, has to be very intentional, right? And there has to be efforts that are, you know, funded efforts sometimes, but that it does really take, you know, everyone's efforts and being on board to slowly start to try to intervene on structural racist practices and policies and, you know, organizations that have for far too long, you know, kind of gone unchecked. And so it's not going to happen overnight. It's not just focusing on one group of people. It really is, it has to be a collective effort. So that's all I would add there.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to another more simply worded, but certainly not more simple question. What are your thoughts on the reemergence of concepts such as eugenics or racial intelligence theory? You know, you could frame this question as, we'd like to think that we're making progress, but you know, I'll open up the floor to whoever would like to address this first.
Personally, I don't think eugenics or the concept of it ever really went away. There's always been a pocket of scientists who have continued to do that type of research and be published, and so it's never really went away. What has happened is that we have gotten better techniques and been able to evaluate data in better ways, and so we can start to address these questions and disprove them. So it's not reemerging. It's not this kind of new phenomenon that's happening. It's always been there, and it will persist. And so we just have to continue to work against it.
In complete agreement with that. I'm exactly as cynical as Dr. Roll about this. It might be useful to get on the table some basic like terminology. So Francis Galton is widely considered to be the creator of eugenics. He was Darwin's cousin, and you know, imagine that Thanksgiving, right? But and so he didn't, as clearly as philosophers love to define eugenics, he actually did it in multiple ways. But the most straightforward way of charitably thinking about what he was working on was with this hypothetical that he called the zoological hypothetical, where if you walked around in a zoo and you were looking at all the different creatures of the world, you can ask this normative question: well, what sort of states would these creatures assent to having in order to live the best life that they can, right? I know it was, I don't know what he was, but that was his hypothetical, and that got him to certain sorts of things are good for certain sorts of species, and certain sorts of things aren't good for certain sorts of species. And like one of those things might be certain kind of health, certain kinds of physical features, and so forth. And that led him to this principle, the eugenic principle of we ought to reproduce and recreate, sort of tinker with the next generation of our species in such a way to bring about those aims that we agreed on in the hypothetical. And one of those aims was health, right? So you could think that in the name of health, tinkering with next generations of species counts as eugenics, right? And actually, Darwin wasn't in favor of vaccines for smallpox, actually, exactly because of the. So he was a bit of eugenicist, in other words. But it's very common. There are countries in the world that have legal sort of. They're involved in the medicine of their country, like Iceland, to recommend certain sorts of interventions in health to make what they think is a more healthier next generation of their population. So, for example, Iceland has is very involved, the government, with abortions of people with Down syndrome, right? Now, you could think like, well, Down syndrome is this medicalized condition, or you could have a different view of these sorts of conditions where it's not as medicalized, you don't even get on that eugenic track. But, so, I mean, if you think about it that way, then it's not really clear that eugenics has ever really left the human species. We've just covered it up in more euphemistic language.
Yeah, well, hence the importance of ongoing conversations like this. It seems in many ways we have just sort of a sometimes destructive use of the term. So another question is, we're talking about the persistence of race in scientific research. So we talked about how science can or cannot help us define race, but is it a useful target for scientific research? So in other words, is it the best term given its conventional usage and perhaps its historical usage, when you could substitute things like population or lineages that science has sort of brought into the lexicon to be more specific when you're talking about these sort of things?
So what I would just say is that I think that, given the U.S. society, the stronghold that race as a notion has had, that, like we mentioned, racism is strong. And so I do think that it would be great if we can have different terminology and different ways to categorize, but we need to make sure that we also are capturing the different experiences of people. So to group everyone together and just kind of ignore it all together, it won't necessarily work, because we know that racialized groups are having different experiences. So I do think, I agree that, we do need to figure out ways, particularly in scientific research. I think what we can start doing is not necessarily, making our findings or study of, like, saying that race, like this racial group, is going to develop this or does this, but like, what's happening? Is it racism, right? Is racism causing this effect, or is it because this person is of a certain race, or it has had these experiences because of their racial grouping? So I do think that we do need to, progress in terms of how we are going to be presenting scientific findings and doing scientific work. But we need to respect the fact that we all have different experiences, and a lot of it has to do with the structural racism that has happened and is happening.
Dr. Spencer, Dr. Roll, anything to add on for that?
I'd just like to say, in a lot of the basic science research and some translational research as well, there is a move towards ancestry and moving away from just race. The issue is, how are we going to standardize how we identify ancestry, and what kind of genetic analysis are we going to do to establish that ancestry? Right now, it's really easy to categorize based on somebody's phenotypic appearance or how they look and how they self-identify. But it's going to be a bigger push for some studies to be able to really to say with certainty that the ancestry of all the participants or all the samples that they're analyzing. It's going to be very costly.
Dr. Spencer, anything to add?
I'm in large agreement. I will say, like, if we're thinking about sciences more broadly, then you're gonna have to include things like political science and so forth. It's not clear at all. You're gonna be able to get empirical adequacy in those sciences without talking about race. Like, try to make sense of what just happened in the last election or the one before that without talking about race. It's gonna be very hard to do that.
All right. Well, obviously we could keep this conversation going. It's one that continues. But I just want to thank all of our viewers again for your engagement. Thank you for our guests for addressing those questions. Again, I think it was a great conversation. I once again want to remind our viewers that if you are enjoying this program, please consider supporting our mission by making a donation at ConnecticutScienceCenter.org or by texting Love Science to 44321. Last but not least, to sort of bring us to the conclusion of our program, I'm going to send it over to the Connecticut Science Center's Melissa Garafola. She is our resident genomics educator, who is going to give us a brief preview of our newest exhibition. It's called Genome in Me, and talk a little bit about the science that has informed our conversation this evening.
Good evening. I hope you've been enjoying tonight's engaging discussion. My name is Melissa Garafola, and I am the genomics educator here at the Connecticut Science Center. As a special treat tonight, we wanted to give you an inside look at our newest permanent exhibition, Genome in Me. This exhibit is especially near and dear to my heart because this has been years in the making, starting all the way back in 2014. And then in June of 2017, when we were able to open our genomics lab on site, we were able to offer consistent genomics programs to our visitors and have some amazing discussions with them. And whether they realized it or not, our visitors had a big hand in this exhibit because their interests and their questions drove its development like never before. In this exhibit, we dive into cutting-edge content, presenting our visitors with the science that they need to combat potential misconceptions about genetic engineering techniques, GMOs, and most importantly for tonight, racial biases in genomics. So let's take a look at some of the exhibits where we purposefully tried to address those misconceptions and combat those racial biases in the field of genomics. Here we have our interactive Discover Your Traits touchscreen. As humans, we have a strong desire to classify things, including ourselves. But as you'll see, our traits are not as simple as they may appear. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of complex gene interactions that cause them. In this touchscreen, you'll be able to explore some key traits like skin and hair pigmentation or eye color, and take a look at the different forms of the genes or alleles that you can change to change the phenotype or the physical appearance of the person. Let's take a closer look. Let's start with skin and hair pigmentation. Skin and hair pigmentation, just like eye color, is all produced by the pigment melanin. And we can make two different types of melanin: eumelanin, which is a little bit darker, and pheomelanin, which has lighter skin and hair colors. So let's take a look at how some genes interact to produce these traits. So here we have three main genes and then a combination of a lot of other genes here working together to produce this phenotype or physical appearance. So let's make some changes and see what happens. So if I change the variants for MC1R, we go from darker skin and hair color to lighter skin and hair color. This is controlling the type of melanin you're making. eumelanin is darker, and our reddish one is pheomelanin. But by changing another gene, I can also make other changes here, going from red hair to another light shade of blonde hair. Every time we change one of these variants, you're seeing that the phenotype changes completely. Then down here, these other genes play a role. And we've found over 100 different genes that contribute to this melanin-producing pathway. This one, TYR, is for tyrosinase, an enzyme that's at the very beginning of the melanin-producing pathway. So if this is off, it's resulting in a form of albinism, no matter what the other combinations are. So as you've seen, this is certainly not a binary trait, is it? Our genomes are not neatly divided into categories, and skin color is not the best representation of the total amount of similarities or differences between individuals or populations. We are discovering more and more just how complex the genetics of skin pigmentation are, and just how much variation we see. There's even more variation among races than there are between them. So we're getting this beautiful, diverse range of all of our skin colors that we see. Another area that can spark misconceptions about race and genomics is ancestry. With millions of people participating in direct-to-consumer genetic tests, naturally, we have questions. So I want to talk about what that data can, and most importantly, cannot tell us. So over here, we are at our Discovering Your Family interactive touchscreen, where you can explore how these ancestry tests work, look at some real data, and meet our friend Barry Green, a Hartford resident whose DNA led him to 10 siblings, spies, and some intercontinental connections. So let's take a closer look at how ancestry tests work. Ancestry tests are not actually looking at our entire genome. They're looking at a small fraction of DNA, and then comparing that DNA to other customers in their databases. They call it reference genomes. But we're not always sure what is in these reference genomes. So let's look at a data set we do know about. So I have here some Legos that are representing 35 million genomes that make up our data set in the Genome-Wide Association studies. So when we're thinking about genes that are related to particular traits or disease, we do these types of studies where we compare millions of different genomes to each other. So it sounds like you got a lot of data, right? But the data set is not particularly diverse. So as of 2016, 81%, all of these yellow Legos, were individuals from European ancestry. We are missing out on a lot of diversity, which makes it hard to make some of these conclusions that we're making in genomics. I just want to leave you with one last thing. As humans, we're a lot more alike than we are different. We share 99.9% of our DNA with one another. It's just 0.1% that makes us beautifully unique and contains all of our differences. So we hope to see you at the Connecticut Science Center soon so you can experience the Genome in Me for yourselves. Thank you again for joining us for tonight's Straight Talk event. And with that, I will turn you back to Amy. Good night.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you for reminding us that our humanity is not ranked, rather it's linked. And I want to thank you, our audience, for choosing to spend part of your snowy Thursday evening with us here at the Connecticut Science Center. Thank you to all my Science Center colleagues, and certainly our wonderful panel of guests, Drs. Rowe, Dr. Roll, Dr. Spencer, and Dr. Thompson. Tonight would not be possible without support from our sponsors. A special thank you always to the Pettit Family Foundation as the founding sponsor of the Women in Science Initiative here at the Connecticut Science Center. Thank you also for additional support from Voya Financial and Vistra. Again, if you've enjoyed this program, please consider donating to us at ctsciencecenter.org or by texting Love Science to 44321. Thank you all again. Stay safe, stay warm, stay well. Good night.